ground rapidly rising up to meet us. A crash was unavoidable now, and all we could do was brace for impact. I closed my eyes and held on tight, suffering from the heavy crash as the chopper hit the ground hard. Shooting up from my seat, my head impacted with cold metal, and I experienced a sharp pain inside my skull. Then I felt myself falling out of consciousness, as suddenly the whole world went dark. I don't know how long I was out for. Minutes, hours. I do vividly recall the appalling nightmares I experienced whilst out of consciousness. Helicopters crashing into balls of flame, motel rooms splattered with blood and gore, Kane standing over me with a butcher's knife at the ready, and a sadistic grin etched across his lips. These grotesque visions were understandable, given the circumstances. The other nightmares were harder to explain, however, those of a burning lake of fire, filled with tormented souls, and red-scaled demons with shark-like teeth going to battle with blue-eyed angels who shone like the sun. When I finally did awake, the first thing I experienced was a dull, throbbing pain in my head. I reached up and felt dried blood on my scalp. Opening my eyes was a struggle, but I managed to do so, only to be confronted by a scene of bloody chaos and carnage. The severed head of Jackson was lying in a pool of blood by my feet. The pilot's mouth was ajar in a silent scream, and his eyes remained open, looking up at me in an almost accusatory glare, like he blamed me for the disaster that had just occurred. I resisted the urge to retch from the foul stench of death, still in a state of shock, as I surveyed what was left of the helicopter's interior. Two of the SWAT team members were visible inside of the cockpit, although it was near impossible to tell which men they were because their bodies had been torn to shreds. Turning my head, I saw a third body thrown outside of the helicopter, his throat torn open by shrapnel and his blood spilled all over the damp grass. As for me, I had miraculously survived and didn't appear to have any significant injuries other than a gash on my head. Whether I pulled through by sheer luck or divine intervention, I cannot say, but I was already experiencing acute survivor's guilt as I shakingly stood up and exited the wrecked aircraft. I tried to take pulses, but soon realized this was futile, as all three officers were clearly dead and our pilot had been decapitated in the crash. Jackson, Doherty, Sard, and Elliott were all gone. But where was Rodriguez? I struggled out of the cockpit, still dazed, but slowly regaining my senses. Walking upon a rocky field, I surveyed the horizon to get my bearings. I'd made it to the island, but only just. The sky above was still black, with only shards of sunlight breaking through. I could see as far as the cliff's edge to my east, but no further. The mainland was not visible, and it seemed like the small isle of Tartarus had been consumed by the dark storm front and cut off from the rest of the world. Stumbling along and adjusting my eyesight, I spotted a black-clad figure in the distance about 100 yards from where I stood. I felt apprehensive for a moment until I recognized the hulking armed man was none other than Sergeant Rodriguez. The SWAT team leader was limping and seemed to be in a state of shock. Nevertheless, Rodriguez still held his rifle and maintained a stern look in his eyes as he struggled across the wet grass. I called out his name, perhaps shaking the man from his shock-induced trance as he glanced over at me in surprise. I felt relief that at least one other team member had survived the crash, and I began to formulate a plan to seek help. But before I could do anything, my ears were assaulted by a piercing, banshee-like wail from above. Looking up, I saw something impossible diving down from the dark clouds. The beast descending had the shape of a humanoid, but with bright red scales instead of skin and a vast wingspan which allowed it to soar through the air at tremendous speed. I stood still, awestruck and terrified, as the beast continued its descent. As it came closer, I could make out its soulless black eyes and vile maw filled with razor-sharp teeth. The beast's target was Rodriguez, and it fell upon him at a rapid speed, unleashing a hellish, bloodthirsty wail as it came. I shouted a warning to my companion, but could only watch in stunned horror as he raised his rifle in an attempt to defend himself. But the armed officer wasn't able to fire even a shot before the monster tore into him, easily knocking the rifle from his hands before burying its sharp claws deep into his flesh. Rodriguez screamed in agony, but the worst was still to come, as the officer was physically pulled upwards by the sheer might of the beast, and the winged monstrosity took flight with its prey firmly secured. Poor Rodriguez was still alive, screaming for help, which I could not give him. I did reach down into my holster and withdrew my 9mm sidearm, but the monster was too far away, and I might accidentally hit my companion. But in an instant, a second monster emerged, another red-scaled harpy near identical to the first. My jaw dropped as I watched the newcomer tear through the air and grab hold of Rodriguez's legs. Before long, the two vile harpies were fighting over possession of their prey, both clawing and ripping until their victim was literally torn in two, which at least finally ended his suffering. I could only look on in disgust and horror as the harpies feasted on my late companion's still warm flesh, spilling his blood and guts on the green grass as they hovered with wings flapping. I guess I'd stayed in the same spot for too long, because the monsters soon finished devouring their meal and turned their attentions towards me. I saw the foul glint in their black eyes as my late companion's blood still poured from their mouths, and I knew I was in big trouble. The two beasts took off in unison, screeching maniacally as they soared through the sky towards me. Acting on instinct, I raised my pistol and opened fire. But after several shots, I realized I stood no chance of taking out both harpies, and so I turned on my heels and ran. I'll admit to being in a state of acute panic at this point, but I did have a plan of sorts. I retreated back towards the downed helicopter, hoping to find sanctuary inside its burnt-out shell. But something had beaten me to it. I heard clawing and rustling from inside the crashed aircraft, followed by what sounded horribly like a creature biting into flesh. As I approached, a hideous demonic face emerged from inside the chopper, staring out at me with those dark, soulless eyes. It was a third harpy, and the blood pouring down its chin surely confirmed it had been feasting on my dead team members. Recoiling in horror, I ran past the chopper and continued my frantic retreat, as the third harpy clambered out of the twisted metal and joined its devilish companions in the pursuit. Scanning the horizon, all I could see in the vicinity was a seemingly abandoned stone cottage across the grass field. I sprinted towards the lonely structure in the hope of sanctuary, but the hellish trio were quickly gaining ground. I could hear their banshee wails and almost feel their hungry glares on the back of my head. The monsters were right on top of me, poised to swoop in and finish me off. But somehow, I reached the house, finding the old wooden door open so I could flee inside. I slammed it shut behind me, hearing the frustrated screeching of the harpies as they clawed at the door and tried to smash their way in through the windows. I knew it wouldn't be long before the monsters broke their way in, and so I reloaded my pistol and prepared for a desperate last defense. But then something amazing happened. I was blinded by a light brighter than the sun, shielding my eyes until the intense illumination faded. At first, I assumed this was another lightning strike, but I heard no thunder, and instead my ears were bombarded by the din of heavenly trumpets. I dared to look outside through the cracked window and observed an angelic presence, a genderless winged humanoid entity dressed in golden armor and glowing like the sun, his eyes a stunning shade of blue, and with a sword of burning fire in his hands. The angel descended to ground level and spoke out in a booming, godlike voice. "Begone, you devilish fiends! Your time in this realm has ended." The Harpies abandoned their previous attempts to break in as all three focused upon the heavenly newcomer. They seemed frightened by the angel's presence, but did not retreat or surrender, instead launching into a savage, if poorly coordinated, attack. Once again, I was reduced to a terrified observer as the demons assaulted the angel one by one. But the heavenly warrior had little difficulty in seeing off their attacks. The first harpy was cut through by his sword of flames, screeching in agony as its body literally burnt away into dust. The angel moved fast, swinging away to chop the second harpy in two. Only the third and final attacker gave my angelic savior any problem, lashing out and cutting him beneath the breastplate with its claws. The angel cried out, but wasn't seriously hurt, only angered. In a flash, he swung his mighty sword and cut the harpy's head from its shoulders, ending the ill-advised attack as quickly as it had begun. The angel sheathed this now extinguished sword, and I noticed how the claw wound on his stomach, healed itself in the blink of an eye. Just then, he turned to look upon me through the glass, his piercing blue eyes seeming to glance into my very soul. And then the angel spoke to me, saying, "Godspeed, sir. I wish you good fortune in the battles to come." And with that, my savior unveiled his vast, feathery wings, flapping furiously as he took off and ascended back into the dark skies.